They called it the miracle of international aid. Billions of dollars. The world's biggest post-Cold War peacekeeping mission, and the promise to turn a war-torn land into a democracy. 30 years later, Cambodia remains one of Southeast Asia's poorest countries, with a poverty rate hovering around 13%. This is not a miracle. It is a heist, one conducted in plain sight. Look closer, and the illusion shatters. The man who ruled for more than 3 decades, Hun Sen, a former Khmer Rouge cadre who once fought alongside the very regime that butchered his country, engineered a political dynasty by handing the premiership to his son, Hun Sen, in 2023, while keeping himself enthroned as Senate president. The United Nations spent $3 billion in the 1990s to build a democratic future, only to watch Cambodia sink deeper into corruption, inequality, and social apathy. The story you have been told about Cambodia is a polished export product crafted for donors, diplomats, and think tanks. The story you have not been told is about a system designed to keep the country dependent, a ruling elite that treats governance as a family inheritance, and a global community that keeps funding the rot while pretending to fight it. In his book, Cambodia's Curse, Pulitzer Prize-winning Joel Brinkley strips away the polite fictions, revealing that the nation's misery is not an accident. It is the logical outcome of historical rot, cultural passivity, and deliberate political engineering. This investigation will pull apart that curse, from Angkor's gilded despotism to the Khmer Rouge's obliteration, from the UN's failed experiment to the entrenched corruption that thrives today. If Cambodia is trapped, it is because too many people, inside and outside its borders, profit from keeping it that way. Angkor's grandeur was not just architecture, it was an operating system, hierarchy at the top, extraction at the bottom. In the 13th century, under King Indravarman III, Angkor was the largest city on Earth, home to nearly 1 million people, covering about 1,000 square kilometers. The Chinese chronicler Zhou Daguan left a postcard from the past that reads like a manual of power. All of his soldiers were gathered in front of him, with people bearing banners, musicians, and drummers following behind. The spectacle dazzled, but the subtext is clear. A rigid order of peasants, officials, and royalty, where access to the court determined access to resources. Even the market was taxed by status. As Joe noted, there is a market every day, from around 6 in the morning until midday, where a small fee is paid to officials. Call it what it is. Corruption institutionalized as routine. When Angkor declined in the 15th century, due to overpopulation, drought, and the shift of trade routes away from its inland heartland, the empire did not just shrink. Cambodia's security architecture collapsed. Once the center, it became a buffer, prey to stronger neighbors like Thailand and Vietnam. In the 19th century, Vietnam's Emperor Minh Mang dismissed Cambodians as lazy, observing they grew just enough rice for 2 meals a day and lacked advanced techniques. Brutal? Yes. Also revealing. A society tethered to nature, short on education, and politically fragmented is a society that can be coerced, carved up, or protected at will. Enter the French with a protection treaty in 1863, sold as a shield against Bangkok and Hue, practiced as a colonial ledger of skims. King Norodom signed, resisted reforms, and performed compliance to keep the throne intact. The result was a state that looked European on paper but remained patrimonial in practice. Officials allegedly pocketed about 40% of national revenue, an astonishing figure that tells you the real constitution of the realm. Not law, but rent. Independence under Sihanouk in 1953 did not scrub the system clean. The court culture that prized spectacle over stewardship endured. As John Bolton recalled of visiting Sihanouk in Paris, it was 10 in the morning, and he was serving champagne, even pouring some for his dog. That is not a charming anecdote. It is a snapshot of priorities. From Angkor's ritualized extraction to the French theater of protection, Cambodia entered the modern era with a bureaucratic shell and a feudal soul, divided, dependent, and unaccustomed to accountability. Those institutional reflexes did not merely enable the Khmer Rouge's rise. They primed the country to be ruled by fear, flattery, and the constant monetization of office. The curse was not born in the 20th century. It was inherited. From 1975 to 1979, Cambodia did not just endure a regime, it was subjected to an industrial-scale erasure of its future. Led by Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge killed roughly 2 million people, about a quarter of the population, through starvation, disease, and execution. The project was systematic: obliterate 20th century life and reset the clock to year zero. That required destroying those who carry knowledge. 80% of teachers and 95% of doctors were murdered. You do not rebuild a country when you have executed the people who know how to run one. Joel Brinkley saw the human wreckage in 1979 and left a line that still burns. Gaunt, glassy-eyed, and possessionless, they crouch in the heat, hungry and diseased. That was not a metaphor. It was the policy outcome, and its echo has not faded. Studies show that 1/3 to 1/2 of survivors suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Chan Sofal, a provincial council chairman, gave testimony that reads like a national diagnosis. "I would like to inform you that I am very, very hungry. Very, very hungry. I cannot sleep because I am so hungry." Hunger became more than a sensation. It became a memory loop, the soundtrack of survival. Trauma is hereditary, not by genes, but by the daily choreography of fear. Nkantha Favi, Cambodia's Minister of Women's Affairs, spelled out the mechanism. It is well known that children who grow up in a home with domestic violence are likely to commit domestic violence themselves. The next generation will be the same. That is how violence reproduces itself in a society silenced by terror. It moves from state policy into household routine, from collective catastrophe into private habit. The Khmer Rouge also trained a nation in the ethics of desperation. Yuk Chang, director of the Documentation Center of Cambodia, put it plainly. To survive during the Khmer Rouge, you had to steal, cheat, lie, point fingers at others, even kill. And now, you are ashamed. Shame is not just an emotion here, it is a political technology. It keeps people quiet. It turns victims into bystanders when officials extort, when land is seized, when evictions are enforced at dawn. PTSD is not merely personal pathology. It is structural. It weakens civic muscle, normalizes silence, and gives impunity a long lease on power. The regime ended in 1979, but its operating system persisted. Atomize society, privatize fear, and make people believe that keeping their heads down is the only rational choice. That is how a revolution dies, and how a quieter, more lucrative form of authoritarianism survives. In 1992, the United Nations did something unprecedented. It turned Cambodia into a de facto protectorate, flew in 16,000 troops and 5,000 civilian staff, and wrote a $3 billion check to manufacture democracy. The sales pitch was immaculate. Elections, institutions, rule of law. The execution was theater. Not in 1993, despite violence, 90% of voters showed up. That statistic looked heroic in donor brochures. But as Joel Brinkley put it, the United Nations, in hindsight, had overestimated its ability to effect democratic change. Ballots without power are souvenirs. The core failure was mechanical and moral. Mechanically, the mission could not disarm the factions that mattered, the Khmer Rouge remnants, and the forces loyal to Hun Sen. When guns stay in play, democracy is cosplay. Morally, the mission pretended that leaders who had no intention of sharing power would suddenly become constitutionalists because foreigners installed ballot boxes. Hun Sen, Norodom Ranarit, and Sihanouk did not so much compete as they wrestled for control of the same patronage machine. By 1997, Hun Sen, once a Khmer Rouge officer, settled the question in the most reliable language of Cambodian politics: force. The coup made the ballot tally irrelevant, and the international applause looked naive. Donors did not withdraw. They rationalized. USAID, the World Bank, and roughly 2,000 NGOs poured in more billions, creating an aid economy that enriched those who controlled access. The outcomes were visible on the street. Brinkley recounts, Hun Chi, a nephew of Prime Minister Hun Sen, had been driving his Cadillac Escalade SUV at high speed. As the motorbike driver lay bleeding to death in the street, numerous traffic police passed the scene without stopping. That is not an anecdote. It is a governance model. Impunity on the boulevard, accountability in the press release. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the pyramid, people earned 34 cents a day in drought years. The arithmetic is cruel but simple. When the cost of corruption is externalized to the poor and the bill is footed by donors, the system sustains itself. International intervention promised to break the curse. Instead, it professionalized it. Electoral choreography without disarmament, rule of law slogans without enforcement, and a never-ending line of checks that kept a predatory elite solvent while the country stayed dependent. Democracy was not built. It was branded. Call it continuity by other means. In Angkor's day, office was something you bought and then monetized. Peasants paid in rice, officials skimmed on the way up, and the palace sealed the loop. That operating logic survived regime changes, ideologies, and even genocide. Today, the optics are different. Ministerial convoys instead of royal processions, but the metabolism is the same. Extract at the top, endure at the bottom. You can see it with the naked eye. In a country where hunger is common, government ministers are the only overweight people, while, as Jean-Pierre de Margerie of the World Food Program said with clinical understatement, the vast majority of rural poor consume only rice. That is not a diet, it is an indictment. The demographics sharpen the picture. About 80% of Cambodia's roughly 16.6 million people live in rural areas. On paper, modernization has arrived. About 95% have electricity, and about 70% have safely managed water. But infrastructure, without institutional integrity, becomes a stage set. Daily life is still defined by subsistence diets and limited access to essential nutrition, because the same old relationships, patronage, bribes, and purchased offices govern how resources move. When rents flow upward, statistics do not feed children. Dependency is not a post-war accident. It is a pre-modern inheritance that was spiritualized and then financialized. The Ravidist Buddhist teaching elevated contentment. Contentment is wealth into a social operating principle. In a healthy polity, that might curb greed. In a predatory one, it anesthetizes resistance. David Ayres captured the educational corollary. Cambodia's traditional education system had always reinforced the concept of helplessness. After the Khmer Rouge, the object of dependency merely changed address, from the monastery and the patron to the donor and the NGO. Unlike Vietnam, which rebuilt through education and infrastructure, Cambodia learned to rely on nature and aid. That is not development. That is survival with better branding. Fear keeps the arrangement quiet. When the government sells land to tycoons or evicts families, protests are the exception, not the rule. Psychiatrist Muni Sothara, head of psychiatry at Priya Kosamak Hospital, decoded the survival skill set. People are passive. The one who survives is the one who is skillful at being deaf and blind. Silence becomes rational behavior in an irrational system. And so the loop closes again. Authority is monetized, dependency is moralized, and poverty is privatized, while the balance sheet of those in charge keeps swelling. 2 countries, 2 traumas, 2 outcomes. Vietnam and Cambodia both crawled out of war. But by any basic yardstick, Vietnam pulled ahead. Per capita GDP is about 2.5 times higher. Vietnam at about $4,300 versus Cambodia at about $1,700. The industrial mix tells the same story. Vietnam turns out pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and steel. Cambodia makes t-shirts and cement. That is not just a market snapshot. It is a map of state capacity. Education is the hinge. Vietnam's literacy rate is about 95%. Cambodia's is about 83.8%, and most Cambodians over 35 have little or no schooling. When you execute a country's teachers and doctors, you do not merely erase the present. You mortgage the next generation. Vietnam, by contrast, rebuilt an education pipeline and then fed it into factories and export platforms. The result is visible from the countryside up. Kenneth Quinn captured the development gradient in a single line. As far as the road went, the new rice went. Pretty soon, you would see metal roofs instead of thatch. That is infrastructure as social policy, and it compounds. Cambodia's countryside tells a harsher tale. About 70% of the roads remain unpaved, a friction tax on everything from school attendance to market access. Farmers resist modern techniques and often grow just 1 rice crop a year, producing some of the lowest rice yields in Asia. Culture gets cited to explain the gap. Vietnamese, influenced by China, valorize education and upward motion. Cambodians, shaped by Indian traditions, are said to embrace passivity. But culture does not confiscate budgets or pave highways. People in power do. When a ruling elite monetizes office and a donor system softens every landing, the predictable result is a low-skill, low-yield equilibrium that keeps the majority compliant and the hierarchy intact. Vietnam chose a different playbook. Build literacy, build roads, build industry, then let the compounding do its work. Cambodia was taught to wait, to make do with nature, with aid, with promises. One path engineers capacity, the other manages dependence. The divergence is not fate, it is policy, enforced from the top and paid for at the bottom. If you strip away the speeches, the ribbon cuttings, and the donor communiques, Cambodia's modern order is brutally simple. Extract at the top, endure at the bottom, and outsource legitimacy to foreigners who keep the checks coming. The poverty rate still circles 13%. The greatest peacekeeping experiment of the 1990s spent $3 billion and built a brand of democracy without its substance. Trauma from 1975 to 1979 still scripts private behavior and public silence. None of this is an accident. It is system design. So what breaks the design? Start with the only lever that ever works: cost. As long as corruption is cheap and profitable, it will scale. Raise the cost and the math changes. That means enforcement that bites on land seizures, on purchased office, on impunity that treats a bleeding motorbike driver as street decor while a Cadillac glides on. It means audits with consequences, not seminars with coffee. International donors cannot claim ignorance anymore. They can only choose complicity or conditionality. You do not build capacity by bankrolling the very networks that monetize state power. Next, build the muscles that atrophied: schools, roads, and the habit of saying no. Cambodia has electricity on paper and safely managed water for a majority, but infrastructure without independent institutions is a stage set. Vietnam's contrast is not destiny, it is policy. The compounding of literacy, roads, and industry across decades. Cambodia can write a different story only if it inverts its old spiritual arithmetic. Contentment may be a private virtue. In public life, it has been weaponized to pacify the poor. An education system that once reinforced helplessness must be rebuilt to teach refusal. Refusal of bribery as normal, refusal of fatalism as wisdom. Finally, break the silence that shame enforces. PTSD is not just a private scar, it is a political variable. A society trained to survive by being deaf and blind will not spontaneously police its rulers. It must be organized to do so, by journalists who will not be bought, by courts that cannot be paid, by communities that will not yield their land at dawn. That is not romanticism. It is the minimal architecture of any country that wants to graduate from dependency to dignity. Two scenarios are on the table. In the status quo, Cambodia keeps its low-skill equilibrium: t-shirts and cement for export, unpaved roads throttling the countryside, a bureaucracy that looks modern and functions medieval, elites who remain the only overweight people in a nation where the rural poor consume only rice. Donors keep writing checks and calling it progress. In the reversal scenario, conditional aid, visible enforcement, and relentless investment in schools and roads begin to compound, slowly at first, then obviously. Literacy rises, yields rise, and with them, the political price of corruption. Power can still be contested. It just gets more expensive to steal. Be careful, you will fall in love with it, and eventually it will break your heart. The ambassador's warning was not about temples or sunsets. It was about promises. Cambodia does not need more of them. It needs fewer illusions, fewer fake elections, fewer aid rituals, fewer excuses for a ruling machine that inherited Angkor's logic and updated it with SUVs and slogans. The curse is not supernatural, it is institutional, and institutions can be rebuilt if those who profit from the curse stop being paid to maintain it.